well, there was the young man's fantasy of being an introverted thinking type, which he had to face was not true, but maybe he could find with his introverted intuition and his wonderful auxiliary extroverted thinking, Jung and INTJ by MBTI terminology. Jung wants to tell us that Salome was his anima, and he was an introverted thinking type, because he was an introvert, and he had thinking, so that meant he was an introverted thinking type, says Jung. And since introverted thinking types have anima figures who are extroverted and feeling, Salome has to be an extroverted feeling type. Tell me that bring me the head of John the Baptist, and lifting the head off the belly dance, the whole thing is extroverted feeling. And I'll have to send you to one of my lieutenants for an education in psychological type. For an introverted intuitive like Jung, extroverted sensation is the sole figure. Jung, thinking he was a thinking type, found an extroverted sensation anima who taught him that he was an introverted intuitive type. That's what really happens in the Red Book. She gives him the gifts of magic, the gifts of prophecy. She gets him to trust his intuition. When he met Salome in his active imagination, Jung did not know he was an intuitive type. He didn't even have the category intuitive type. That category was offered to him by a real-life woman, Maria Molzer, who gave a talk in 1916 and said there should be a third function to thinking and feeling, and that was introverted intuitive. The intuitive function, she said, not introverted, but the intuitive function. And Jung later realized there needed also to be a sensation function, and so by the time he wrote Psychological Types, he had 4 functions, and he had 2 attitudes, and so you got 8 function attitudes. Right. Surely isn't that extroverted sensation, just what you would expect from the type theory, introverted intuitive man with extroverted sensation anima. So what about Jung's thinking? Well, wasn't his thinking an auxiliary extroverted thinking that he tried to use as Siegfried to help Sigmund, who was using anima extroverted thinking and the creative surge and the wish for loyalty? He had to accept her as his anima, and he'd already made up his mind that he was going to get his soul back, whoever she was, and that's who it was. And so out of that came a kind of embodied realism to Jung, which I think makes his psychology very, very exciting. So notice how the categories Jung himself gave us in the book Psychological Types, and I've named quite a few of them. I named introverted feeling for Jung's Freud's dominant function. I named introverted intuition for Jung's dominant function. I named extroverted thinking for Freud's anima. I named extroverted sensation for Jung's anima figure. And I named this extroverted thinking as a well-meaning fatherliness toward Freud that was taking place in the case of being Siegfried, the loyal son to the father. But then I brought in a new figure, Philemon, who was Jung's wise old man, a wise and intelligent Synex who would have introverted thinking. So you begin to see how different parts of a person, different figures in a person, and dynamics between people, and dynamics between parts of ourselves are all governed by these 8 function attitudes of consciousness. Well, there was the young man's fantasy of being an introverted thinking type, which he had to face was not true, but maybe he could find with his introverted intuition and his wonderful auxiliary extroverted thinking, Jung and INTJ by MBTI terminology, may have been able, he would have thought, to do a better job than Freud at writing a theory. And then he discovers that the very act to be so sure of your ground when you're talking about the psyche as part of the problem And so he goes inside and increases something. What is that something he increases? He goes from extroverted thinking to introverted thinking, which is an enormous stretch, particularly when there's a very idealistic boy in him who is the introverted feeling type that got the religious crush on Freud and was willing finally to become the son. So in the way, the son is using his extroverted thinking to help the father, but the introverted feeling wants to find a psychology that really feels good and is very snobby and ruthless about it. And what he finds he needs is to go all the way from introverted feeling to introverted thinking, to construct an attitude that's adequate to writing psychology. And I got to tell you how hard that is. It's very, very hard to stretch beyond yourself in that way. Have you ever, as a psychotherapist, had someone who has dominant introverted feeling and tried to use introverted thinking in talking to them? It's quite an unpleasant experience, I have to tell you. And have you ever had an introverted thinking type in your life and you've tried to explain introverted feeling to them in the simplest way? It just is, we all know there's such a thing as being not 6 degrees of separation, but 7 degrees of separation from another person. And we all, sooner or later, have that other person close in somewhere in our lives. It's like life itself is constantly asking us to make this stretch. Well, I think Jung made that stretch. And what he constructed for psychology, and it's still not recognized enough, is what I would call an adequate philosophic attitude. And by a philosophic attitude, I don't mean just the ability to philosophize. Jung was really not interested in becoming, for instance, a theosophist. He wasn't interested in that. There are analogies to Rudolf Steiner, there are analogies to Swedenborg, but he didn't want to be there. He actually had the ambition of doing something with psychology that was close in some ways to Immanuel Kant, and at the same time, he wanted to be able to understand the kind of introverted feeling that when it isn't respected makes people psychologically ill. He was a therapeutic psychiatrist who actually developed a way of talking about psychology that makes the introverted feeling and the introverted thinking come together. And he's given many of us a philosophic attitude toward reading psychology and reading psychological theory. And following that path, I have to say, is quite something. And I feel that that ability to generate that kind of philosophical attitude towards psychology makes him a philosopher of psychology and a psychologist of philosophy. It's really quite something. Philosophy is not just a set of good ideas. It's also a set of good ideas that have been tested for their value. If you really read a really great philosopher like Wittgenstein, part of the wonderful thing about Wittgenstein is not just his introverted thinking, which is sublime, but also the degree of introverted feeling he joins to it to try to question the value of an idea. It's a very strong thing. Well, anyway, Jung got as close to that as I think any psychologist has been able to do. It's not the general view of him, but that he did. And there I think he really achieved something for his writing by discovering Philemon. So, Faust was at an end, selling your soul to just give yourself over to the extroverted thinking project of another man and of yourself and medical ambition. That's the repentance. That has to be repented at Bollinger. The stretch that takes place is to go to introverted thinking and to make sure that it checks out with an introverted feeling sense of what psychology needs. So let's look for a minute to understand how I'm thinking here. Let's look at introverted feeling as a function that involves initially judging, appraising, and finally establishing the value. And so when a Jungian looks at a psychological idea, a Jungian will judge it, appraise it, and establish its value. And if it's really a value for the psyche, they hold on to it. If it's not a value, they don't hold on to it. They won't accept it. And that's what I've loved about being a Jungian. At the same time, and this is where I think Jungians have sometimes not done the job they could have done, and I step in thinking that I can help, is that I think things need to be named properly, they need to be defined clearly and freshly, and that should lead to greater understanding. When you can get the kind of understanding that you can establish the value of, and you can, at the same time, value understanding, then you can get to this amazing thing that Jung was able to get to at times at Bollingen, when in retreat, Philemon could speak to him, and not as a knower, but as a learner from his own unconscious, his introverted feeling, which was priggish and difficult and judgmental. It comes up repeatedly in the Red Book as a kind of inflated sort of thing that needs to learn a lot. That part of him yielded to a larger philosophy of a psychology for humanity. So all of that was how Jung developed he developed his rational side in a very extraordinary way by stretching it beyond the limitations of just any other German intellectual. Now, I'd like to shift ground completely and show you something much more fun, much less dire, and just as real a problem for all of us. But first, you need a stretch. You have to step in your chair. You have to sort of stay around because I've got some stuff to show you before we break, and I need to show you a film clip. So I can't let you have refreshments and so forth. We'll be here till 10 o'clock, or you'll leave and you won't get the good part. But just move around. Remind yourself you have bodies. Live, breathe. Forget what I've just said.